Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. This is a second session for our capacity building session organized by the Loss and Damage Relief Coalition and the Yungo through the PCCB network. The first session focused on the different progress on loss and damage in the negotiation rooms, where we had a deep dive on the Santiago network, the WIM, and the different progress that have happened so far. So my name is Eva Peace Mukairanga. I'm part of the Loss and Damage Relief Coalition, which is an international network of young people from all over the world working together to demand ambitious action on loss and damage issues. And I will serve as today's moderator. And I'm joined today by two guest speakers, Hilary Aragon from the Christian Aid and Harjit Singh, which is the Global Engagement Director at the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So I'll not take too much time, but as you come in, do feel free to go ahead and drop in the chat where you're calling from. So today's presentation will start with Hilary. She'll give us a background on the new collective quantified goal, which is a big topic this year, as we hope to have a new goal replacing the 100 billion goal at COP29. So thanks again for joining, and then I'll pass over to Hilary to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Eva, and I am very, very happy to be here to share some perspectives on the NCQG with you. I'm going to just share my screen now. So I was asked to share with you today some background on the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal. So talk a little bit about the background, the progress so far in the negotiations, the sticking points, obviously the main contentious issues, as well as some considerations about the integration of loss and damage in the new goal. My name is Hilary Aragon, and I work for Christian Aid. I'm based in the UK. So the new collective quantified goal, known as the NCQG, as we know, as Eva said, it's really the new global climate finance target under the Paris Agreement that is designed to replace the 100 billion annual target that was set at the Copenhagen summit back in 2009. The NCQG is really set to be finalized this year at COP29. So this COP, it's really important. It is a kind of finance COP. Really. The NCQG is a negotiated target. It's not a politically determined figure as the 100 billion goal was, really. That was pretty much agreed behind closed doors. This is a negotiated target, and deliberations on the NCQG started in 2022. There have been multiple technical expert dialogues known as TEDs that have been happening since that year, normally 4 every year. And most recently, we have had the 10th TED and the second meeting of the ad hoc working program on the NCQG taking place in June this year during the intersessional session in Bonn. That's the latest in terms of what has happened. The next NCQG meetings are TED 11 and the third meeting of the ad hoc work program on the NCQG that is due to take place in Baku next month in September. I don't seem to be able to share, to go next. Right. Okay, there we go. Sorry. So this slide is about a general expectation. As we know, the NCQG, we want this really goal to learn from lessons of the 100 billion and represent a better target this time around. We want a target that is adequate, that is needs-based, that it has balanced allocations, that has more quality of finance, more accountability, and especially more transparency. we all know about we have all heard about the shortcomings of the 100 billion. We know that it really lacked balance. We saw a lot of finance going to mitigation and less for adaptation. We saw a lot of this climate finance being channeled through the use of loans, even for climate action like adaptation, which doesn't really generate profit, that is not repayable. We didn't see really loss and damage there at all. And in general, 100 billion was really just a symbolic number that represents only a fraction of what is really needed to meet needs in developing countries. So we also know that the 100 billion was very ambiguous. The language used to describe the goal and what can be counted towards it was very, very ambiguous. The 100 billion goal was little more than a statement. It only said developed countries should jointly mobilize 100 billion from a wide variety of resources, but it didn't really specify who specifically. It didn't really say anything about the quality of the instruments to be used, for what areas of climate action, adaptation, mitigation. It didn't really specify anything about the suitability of specific instruments for different climate action types. So we ended up with a lot of loans. We ended up with a lot of finance for mitigation and not so much in terms of grants, things like that. So really the idea is that the NCQG should build on all of these lessons and shortcomings from the past and tries to do something better. But that's why it's so difficult to agree on, because there are so many elements and so many contentious points. It's also worth mentioning that the NCQG is a unique process in climate finance in that it places emphasis on the needs and priorities of developing nations at the center of discussions. As we know, climate finance is crucial for enabling ambition in NDCs. And as we know, we are going to see new versions of NDCs, new updated NDCs coming up early next year. So we want to see the finance coming through for the implementation of those, obviously. So how much do we know about the financial needs? Well, financial needs are estimated in the trillions. We have also heard that we really do need trillions to meet climate targets. And we can reference the needs determination report, which is an important report produced by the Standing Committee on Finance. So it's a mandated report that landed on 5.8 to 5.9 trillion of costed needs up to 2030. So it is important because this report produced an aggregate of basically the costed actions that countries included in NDCs. This first NDR report was produced in 2021, and it came up with these estimates, but we expect a second iteration of the NDR to come up in October this year, and this report will be informative for the NCQG outcome later in the year. It is also very important to mention that the NDR does not really produce new information. What it does is just basically looks at information already contained in countries' NDCs and produces an assessment. It aggregates information and produces total assessments. That's basically what it does. And this report also notes something very crucial, which is acute data gaps, especially for fields like adaptation and loss and damage. It basically says that countries are not including costed actions to respond to adaptation and loss and damage in sufficient level of detail. And of course, methodologically, this is hard to do, but it is also in the interest of countries to start reporting, start including information on this type of climate action with more detail in new NDCs. But that is probably a topic for another webinar. So now to the contentious points in setting up the NCQG. As I said, the NCQG is a process that covers pretty much all issues in finance, and it has been quite complex to unpack and to discuss. As I said, discussions started in 2022 and they still continue. I don't see huge amounts of progress, and I started follow this since that one. To be honest, to some extent, we're still talking about some of the same issues, really, but because the issues are very, very difficult and some of them are very political indeed. One issue that is quite tricky is the financial scale. So developing nations are advocating for significantly increased funding, rightly so. Most note the 5.8 to 5.9 trillion by 2030, as indicated, as reported by the Needs Determination Report. And some group of countries like AGN, LDMC, and the Arab Group and India have also noted annual estimates, so 1.1 to 1.3 trillion annually as the quantum for the goal. Developed countries on their part have not really mentioned any figure yet. Only that, the NCQG should really build from the 100 billion minimum base, but that's just part of the mandate. So the contributor base is a second major issue that is being contentious. So basically, this is about who will be responsible for delivering the goal. While developing countries are pressing for ambitious targets, developed countries express concern about the scale of demands. They say ambition must align with reality, and they want the contributor base to be expanded and have an expansive goal that includes money mobilized from private sector and other sources, because in their view, public funding is just not going to be enough. It's just never going to be enough. I think this contentious issue of contributor base has been really going for a long time. It's nothing really new in these discussions, and there are basically two camps here. Developed countries, as I said, want this to be expanded. They argue that the world is very different to the way it was back in 1992 when annexes were created. And they argue that the ability to contribute and the responsibility to do so of some countries has also evolved. And they argue that high emitters and high GDP countries also need to contribute, mainly reference to Gulf states and countries like China, which are technically still considered developing countries for the purpose of this. And the tricky issue is that developing countries are connecting the whole quantum question to who is contributing. In other words, the quantum and the ambition of the quantum will depend on how large the contributor base is. So this is a very political issue, and it's one that has been quite difficult to approach technically, but also politically. Developing countries on their part, referring to common but differentiating responsibilities and respective capabilities, argue, look, guys, this is not a problem that we have created. This is your responsibility, and this responsibility is clearly determined in the Convention of the Paris Agreement. And it is really not the place or the time to be relitigating these issues. And rightly so. I mean, really, this could take a long time. And meanwhile, there is a deadline to agree on the NCQG, so things could be really tricky. We hope that maybe ministers, when they meet before COP29 to talk about the NCQG, will could approach this issue politically and maybe come up with some solutions and way forwards about this. Another tricky issue is there is just not common understanding of what counts. And again, this isn't really anything new. This is an old issue, but it's still an issue. Currently, no climate finance definition exists. And the 100 billion target has fallen short, has been misrepresented or overestimated, leading to calls to improve granularity, tracking, and accountability of the NCQG, learning from lessons of the 100 billion, of course. So basically, what we have at the moment is an abundance of different reporting practices by donor countries, which demonstrate a different understanding of what they consider and report as climate finance. You might have seen the Reuters report last year, for example, which found that large sums of money have been reported as climate finance, are going to projects including coal plants, hotel and chocolate shops, airport expansions, and things like that. I'm sure some of those projects have a climate component to it, but it's not clear to what extent that is sufficiently relevant. So, and some have really called this as a sort of Wild West of climate finance. And again, just to give you another illustration, to really respond to the question, how far are we from meeting the 100 billion pledge? I think the answer is, my answer would be, it really depends on what report you're looking at and the accounting method that is used for that report. The OECD reports produce certain estimates of progress using certain methodology, but then the Oxfam produces a different progress reports, and they arrive to a real value of climate finance because they use different methodology, and they arrive to a very lower estimates of net climate finance. So this whole difference and this lack of common methodology and definitions to approach this has really led to different estimates of progress, different different views on the accuracy and the relevance of data, and of course mistrust in relation to where the progress really is, and mistrust in relation to the whole system. I personally don't think that it is really about investing a lot of time, and there isn't really time, to try to come up with a list of things, a typology of climate finance, like what counts specifically, like a list or even a paragraph that everyone can agree on, because that has been tried many times before, and there isn't really the time or the political appetite to do that. But it is really about defining climate finance by defining the NCQG with much more granularity and the various aspects that form part of it. For example, some parties calling for a common understanding of what counts, or at least an agreement of what should not be counted as climate finance in the context of the NCQG. They say, for instance, for the NCQG, loans at market rate cannot be counted. They have been counted in the past. That needs to stop. Export credits as instruments cannot be counted. ODA, official development assistance, cannot be counted as climate finance. Climate finance is different from that. So yes, some parties are at least approaching this kind of negative approach of at least defining what should not be part of it, which is interesting. Another issue, another contention issue to really highlight is that NCQG is not just about quantity, it's not just about the quantum, but it is also about quality. So quantum is, of course, a centerpiece, but quality is also fundamental. We have, over the past 2 years that I have been following this process, I have heard in pretty much every single TED concerns from developing countries about the debt burden that climate finance is creating, about the current level of debt and the fact that climate finance must not really exacerbate this situation. They have emphasized the over-reliance on loans to deliver climate finance, even for the poorest countries, and that must stop. Also, the lack of balance, the fact that a lot of climate finance has gone to mitigation and really not so much for adaptation. That balance is an issue of quality, and that has to be corrected. Issues of predictability and climate finance are issues of quality, and the whole quality component is something that the NCQG should really look at in a lot of detail. Another issue, dynamic versus static. What about review? So once finalized, the NCQG will begin to take effect in 2025. And some are calling for review and adjustment to ensure that the NCQG aligns with increasing climate finance needs in the future. Because as global warming continues, adaptation will continue, and also finance for loss and damage will increase. So the considerations about reviewing the NCQG is important for many developing countries. Questions about when to do this. So it depends also on the NCQG cycle. So if we agree to something that is 10-year long, then maybe the review at half point and also to align with the NCQG cycle could be an option. But then the question is, what exactly will be reviewed? Will it be just the target amount? Will it just be the figure, or will it be all components of the NCQG? Some questions about when to review, how to review, and what exactly to review are still issues that are being considered and they need more discussion. The inclusion of loss and damage, I can say all developed developing country groups are calling for the incorporation of loss and damage as part of the NCQG. I think that message has been pretty consistent throughout all technical discussions. They really advocate for the inclusion of sub-goals for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage to secure new, additional, predictable, and adequate resources going to loss and damage. And also emphasizing the fact that loss and damage should be financed through grants. And we talked about the different types of instruments, that they should be relevant for different fields of climate action. Obviously, action on loss and damage, addressing loss and damage is never going to generate profit. It's not going to be something repayable. And as a question of climate justice, it can be, it shouldn't really be. So it is really something that has to be funded through grants. And that's really the voice of many developing countries consistently throughout the NCQG process. It's still what I feel that is very much under consideration. It hasn't been clear, I think, or clearly stated, is whether they should be represented as a dollar figure. So when we talk about sub-goals, whether there should be a dollar figure attached to the sub-goal specifically, or a percentage. That is something that is still being, I think, considered and being debated. Now on to less contentious points. Maybe just to finalize with this, in my view, from what I have seen in this process so far, access to climate finance is something that I can say that everyone agrees that it should really be better. I don't really think there has been much controversy about that. And it is true that it is not just access to finance by government entities. I think the message has also been about accessing finance by local communities, by subnational governments, by vulnerable groups, by vulnerable populations, the women, youth groups, and that they should really access finance more adequately and more faster, basically. So I think there seems to be consensus that current access modalities have been too complicated for developing countries, even for like state institutions. Accessing the Green Climate Fund is incredibly costly and complicated and lengthy. Processes have to be simplified. There has to be much more readiness support, more capacity building, prioritization of vulnerable groups, and above all, the NCQG must ensure that access is really enhanced access is really a core component, and that it ensures that finance reaches communities on the ground. Otherwise, what really is the point? Transparency is an issue where I see there is maybe more common ground, like enhanced access. I think broadly speaking, I can see that most people agree that the enhanced transparency framework is really the accepted framework. The backbone for the NCQG is already the agreed system of transparency for the Paris Agreement. So instead of creating something new, parties want to build on this, but it is widely acknowledged that it has to be complemented and adapted to be fit for purpose for the NCQG. Obviously, what needs to be changed is still unclear because we don't know what the NCQG would look like yet. But broadly speaking, I think the ETF would be the kind of core for this. Biennial transparency reports are the reports under the ETF, and they are accepted as the reporting vehicle for data collection, but also the verification and the collective assessment of progress is also needed, and maybe needed on a yearly basis. So instead of having different reports but produced by different organizations that are not part of the UNFCCC system, I think the view is now to maybe mandate the Standing Committee on Finance to produce a collective assessment of progress based on the BTRs that are basically submitted by countries individually on the status of progress of the NCQG. That's more or less the thinking about transparency. And I will leave it here for now, but thank you. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Larry, for this great presentation and giving us a background on the NCQG. Also for highlighting how the current needs of climate finance in the scale of trillions, and also noted how it's not just about the quantum, but also about the quality of finance and how it's important to have a climate finance definition in order to build trust, also to have a common understanding of what climate finance have been mobilized and provided. I think we'll have a time for a Q&A after the presentation, after another presentation. So please do not, in the meantime, your question. I would just like to invite, pass the floor to Haji to give us an overview on the ongoing board meeting process for the fund for responding on loss and damage. Your thoughts on what are the current challenge and recommendation in operationalizing the fund, and what will be the adequate sources of finance to consider for loss and damage. Thank you so much again. I'm passing you the floor.
Thank you so much, Eva, for having me for this session. Hello, everyone. I'm Harjeet Singh, and I'm based in New Delhi. I've been following loss and damage negotiations for more than 15 years. And today, as Eva said, I'm going to give you a brief update on what has happened so far, and particularly highlighting some of the key issues going forward. And I'll build a lot on what Ilari very eloquently explained in terms of issues, and that's what we are dealing with as we follow very closely what's happening at the Loss and Damage Fund Board meetings. Of course, you know that this has been a long journey of 30 years, and the progress that has been made so far is unprecedented in many ways, what we saw happening in the last 24 months. But when you look at whether it is commensurate to the need, we are nowhere near what is absolutely needed by vulnerable communities and countries who are already facing climate emergency. So the money that has been mobilized so far is to the tune of $700 billion, which, as per a Guardian report, not even or barely close to 0.2% of the overall needs, which are actually running into trillions of dollars. Of course, now with this new institutional arrangement, we are moving forward to create a fund which should meet those needs. But if you look at where we are not moving forward both in terms of speed and scale that is needed by communities and countries. So far, we have had 2 board meetings, and most of these meetings have been largely looking at the administrative matters, and for all the right reasons, because it's a new fund that's being operationalized. So one has to make sure that all the administrative processes in terms of finalizing the agreement with the World Bank as the host and trustee of the Secretariat, as well as legal host for the Loss and Damage Fund, and putting together the Secretariat that's going to be leading on the implementation with the guidance from the board. So the last board meeting agreed on the formal name of the fund. So of course, we have been calling it Loss and Damage Fund. And there was a lot of effort to even remove the fund, the loss and damage term from the name itself. But thankfully, the name that has been agreed is now Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And Philippines has been confirmed to host the Loss and Damage Fund board and provided the legal identity that is needed. The meeting also set off the executive director hiring process, which is going to get finalized by COP29. So the next board meeting in Baku, the third one, is happening from 17th to 20th. So day 1 is going to be more of preparatory, but 18th to 20th are going to be the formal meeting days, where they are going to be looking at several agenda items, particularly the executive director's hiring process, which is already in play. The last board meeting also approved the board work plan, but the challenge that we saw that they moved the resource mobilization discourse to 2025, to the end of 2025, which has been really concerning for us because, as I said earlier, and you heard from Ilari, how the scale of funding has been a huge gap, and we have not even able to receive the money that has been pledged. So how we are going to raise more money. There are a number of things that are going to be discussed in the next board meetings, such as we are demanding direct access for developing countries, also how to enable community level access so that countries are able to provide resource to communities, not only through the direct budgetary support, but communities also able to access directly where it is challenging for communities to directly receive money, or even for innovation and also providing them leadership on it. There are also going to be discussions on the financial instruments, even observer participation as civil society, and there are other administrative issues such as travel policy and rules of procedure. One big thing that's going to happen at the next board meeting is going to be the finalization of World Bank as the host and trustee, which is going to require a lot of documentation as the entity that's going to be created. So that's going to happen again, as I briefly mentioned, that $700 million that have been pledged have not even been received, and we are continuously pushing so that money now starts moving to countries and communities who need it for addressing loss and damage. Now, if I broadly categorize some of these issues, these are speed in which how money can be provided to both communities and countries, and that's why the direct budgetary support is going to be important. And similarly, I talked about the access, which is linked to that, how communities can access directly. So speed and access are going to be really important issues to make sure that support is provided in a manner that communities are able to utilize it for the intended purpose. Then it's about scale. Again, it's extremely difficult and painful to see that the conversation on how to go beyond the existing pledges is not happening. And as civil society, we are continuously putting pressure to look at, and that's where the conversation connects with NCQG, because when we look at increasing climate impacts, and particularly they are happening because of lack of mitigation and adaptation um, support that has been provided to developing countries over the last 30 years, and the inaction by developed countries for not meeting their targets has taken things to a point where we now need trillions of dollars, and there is very little conversation. And the resource mobilization strategy being pushed to 2025 is not a good sign. So we are pushing that conversation needs to happen now, and not only when the formal approval that is due. So that conversation can very well begin at this moment. So that's another issue which is linked to scale. Then linked to that is going to be sources. So if we need to mobilize hundreds of billions of dollars reaching to trillions, how we are going to be looking at various sources. When we talk about sources as civil society or developing countries, we mean looking at various instruments, building on public finance as the core element of that. Whereas developed countries look at it also expanding the contributor base, something that Ilari was explaining happening as part of the NCQG conversation, which makes things extremely complex and contentious. Because from our perspective, it is about the responsibility and liability of developed countries. Of course, that's the reason they would like to expand, and they are completely ignoring the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And again, I'll not go deep into it because Larry also already covered the definition and scope are also extremely important, because if we do not define climate finance, and particularly looking at the elements related to loss and damage, where we talk about both economic as well as non-economic losses, and also looking at how these impacts are happening due to extreme weather events and slow onset events such as rising seas and melting of glaciers. So developed countries continue to push for a more narrower definition, and when we are going to be working on the allocation framework or what activities are going to be funded, those discussions are going to get extremely complex. Now, coming to a sources part, Again, developing countries have made it very clear that it's responsibility of developed countries. But if there are other developing countries, large ones who now have more resources, if they are willing to put money, of course, as part of our climate finance agreed under Paris Agreement, there is an article that clearly provides that space for other developing countries to contribute without taking that as a legal responsibility. So from our perspective, we would really like to see that the public finance happens to be at the very core of loss and damage finance, but then that can be coupled by number of other, as we call them, innovative sources of finance. And this is something not new. We have been talking about some of these sources for a very long time, and there's a large category which is carbon taxes on carbon emissions, and how we then discourage emissions being increased, but rather create more opportunities and avenues and pressure on the high emitting countries and companies to start reducing their emissions by taxing them adequately. There are other number of sources that we have looked at, such as financial transaction tax. So it could be on currency, on stock exchange, and other financial activities that can help generate. We also know that there are very high emitting sectors that have been kept out of the ambit of the conversation so far, such as aviation and maritime levies, and there are other governing institutions that we need to be involving to put a tax that not only helps the industry to get green, but also contribute to respond to climate action. And as part of carbon taxes and as part of looking at extraction from the fossil fuel industry, there are a number of ways we are looking at how extraction itself can be taxed, and climate damages tax, for example, is one such way of doing it. In fact, there was a recent report which calculated that we will be able to raise $900 billion if we put an initial rate of $5 per ton of carbon dioxide, and then in this year, in 2024, and then increase it every year. That can raise that scale of money, out of which $720 billion should be allocated for loss and damage fund, while remaining $180 billion can be retained for just transition in those countries. So here the target is OECD countries, the advanced economies, who are also historically responsible for the crisis. There are other funding sources which I mentioned can raise 100 to 200 billion dollars, and even like currency exchange tax, as per some calculations, from 50 to 200 billion dollars. Stock transaction tax, 10 to 50 billion dollars. So really, it's not about lack of money, but more of political will that can help us raise money in hundreds of billions of dollars, as I just alluded to. So really, then it's about looking at sources which can enable redistribution of these resources. And another big source that we look at is fossil fuel subsidies, and we know that's also running into trillions of dollars, and how those sources can be tapped to not only raise money for loss and damage, but also penalize fossil fuel industry that is primarily responsible for the crisis. So again, as I said, scale is going to be extremely important if we are to make sure that the fund that has been created after a lot of efforts and after a wait of 30 years is able to help communities at a scale at which it's needed, following the principles of equity and justice. Another issue that keeps coming up, and if I can briefly touch upon that, and we can have a conversation later, is the Mosaic funding arrangement. Now, there are different interpretations of that. One way of looking at it is the diverse funding sources. Again, as I mentioned, one element is public finance, which we as civil society and developing countries are very clear has to be at the core of it, and then many other carbon pricing mechanisms and the ones that I mentioned. Another way of looking at Mosaic related to loss and damage finance is looking at various delivery channels, and this is where we had a huge fight over the last more than 2 years now, looking at loss and damage fund as the central piece to channel hundreds of billions of dollars. and whereas developed countries want to continue with other channels, including Green Climate Fund, where they see some part of money is going for loss and damage, which we don't agree to. Then, of course, there are other bilateral and multilateral sources. And there's also a stream of humanitarian finance, which we think that there's a tiny amount of overlap, but not really huge, because that exactly is the point that we are raising, that loss and damage fund should mainly look at relief, when we look at rehabilitation and reconstruction, which is normally not covered through humanitarian finance. There's another stream which again gets pushed a lot by countries such as Germany, the US, European Union, Japan, and others, which is looking at insurance and risk transfer mechanisms as part of one of the funding mechanisms. Now, from our perspective, it's a real tiny part of the overall loss and damage finance, because we know that it's not really meeting the needs of vulnerable communities, and it also has a justice issue, because you can't expect poor communities and countries to pay for the premium. Even if you subsidize that, it's not going to meet the entire cost. That's one. And second, it's not doesn't pass the test of equity and justice. And third, we're also seeing with increasing number of climate impacts, it's becoming a lot more infeasible even in developed countries. So how it can work for developing countries remains a big question. So really, just to sum it up, the contentious issues that we are looking at, which coincide very well with the conversations going around NCQG and how loss and damage needs to be included. But overall, it's about responsibility of developed countries based on equity. And it's also about looking at the funding sources, which is going to get a lot more contentious as part of loss and damage fund conversations as well. Which sources we can and who is going to contribute, and whether we are going to be able to apply the equity and justice lens. Then there is also a whole governance issue. And the reason developed countries keep talking about the various funding sources or different financial tools is also a control issue. We are very clear that it's should be led by developing countries to not only define their needs in terms of what is needed and what kind of scale that is required and how it needs to be channeled, and not something that has been happening over the last several decades as part of humanitarian or development aid, where a lot of strings are attached. So we need to make sure that the governance is led by developing countries, and communities have a role to play. And then, of course, it has to be effective and efficient. And especially when we look at loss and damage fund, we can't look at spending time working on proposals when communities need money urgently. Let me stop here so that we have some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hajit, for this, for sharing your thoughts and highlighting one of the 3 points to keep an eye on while the loss and damage fund is being operationalized. Noted about the need for local community to gain access, the scale, but also different financial instruments that could be used. Noting the public finance to be at the core, but also for highlighting the different innovative source of finance that could be provided. I will just open the floor for question to be able to have some discussion, or we can go with Ugochukwu, if you are able to unmute.
All right, sure. Thank you very much for having me, please. My name is Ugochukwu Zwebo. I'm joining you from Abuja, Nigeria. My question exactly is that while we're trying to hold developing countries, as in developed countries, accountable for being the major polluters, having them provide finance for loss and damage, there are several concerns in developing countries such as mine in Nigeria, where the subnationals are complaining about their inability to access funds, because when the federal government, like right here we operate a federal government system, when the federal government gets this finance, it does not trickle down to the subnationals, which is where the impacts of climate change actually happens. So is there kind of mechanisms to ensure accountability that whatever funds that are released, that subnational entities are able to access funds directly? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ugochukwu. Can we take again another question from Martin and then pass to?
My name is Martin Chibuzo Obte. I'm a climate advisor and also a climate trained at International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. I'm very, very happy for this wonderful presentation from you, sir, concerning climate financing and loss and damage. You know, one major problem we have in this global community is about how to access climate finance, how to access funds for climate project or program. And yes, some people are willing to donate money, donate their funds or resources for climate projects. But we find out that the international organizations like UN and UNFC, they like channeling these funds to governments. And me, I'm talking based on experience as an African descent, you know, as someone coming from African background. So you know that leaving people to abject poverty instead of using the fund for the necessary things that the funds are meant for. So again, in tackling in climate financing, again, this is a question. This one is a question now. I suggest that in demanding for countries to contribute for climate funds now, countries that are polluting the world.
I don't know if others can hear, but I think I've got the gist of your question and the previous one, which are quite similar and also from Nigeria. So let me try and respond. You're absolutely right. There are huge challenges communities are facing to access the money, and that's why in my presentation I specifically refer to that as one of our key demands that has been there. So we as civil society have been demanding a community access fund, explaining that this has been a long-standing demand, exactly looking at some of the challenges that you shared. But what we need to realize that we need to create a system that is transparent and that is accountable. And that cannot only happen at the international level. We need to make sure that those accountabilities are set from local to subnational to national to global levels. When we go to these processes at the international level, and the conversations are happening right now, we are putting a lot of emphasis on those elements. And we are going to be putting in such systems in place in terms of fiduciary standards, participation of civil society, leadership of communities, community-led approaches. All those terminologies are going to be embedded as part of the governance mechanism, exactly addressing the concerns that you are sharing. But let's also recognize the fact that we cannot say that money should not go to government, especially when we look at the post-disaster context. Large-scale infrastructure cannot be built by communities, right? Large-scale service delivery and the public distribution system or public service delivery has to be done by governments. What we need, as I keep saying, is those transparent, accountable system. At the same time, we also need to make sure that communities are able to access that money directly. And that's where we are right now, as we speak, putting those demands again and again in these conversations, sharing our ideas and measures that need to be there to ensure community access. And another issue that you shared is the intermediary organization, how we can reduce that, is the interference of intermediary organization. In some cases, they are needed, because you cannot expect a global fund to be reached by thousands of civil society organizations or communities directly. So you need to have some mechanism in place, but not to take away a huge amount of money with very least administrative cost. So I just want to assure you that the concerns that you raised are being discussed right now at the board meetings. We are very aware of that. Please keep sharing your ideas, but also specific solutions that we can put forth in these discussions, so that money that goes directly to countries can be made accountable through strong civil society participation in countries, as well as at the global levels, and enabling access to money directly for communities.
Thank you so much, Hajit,
Thank you very much.
for the answer. Maybe I could read one more question in the chat. So what will be the funding? What will be the funding cover for loss and damage funds? And will it reimburse countries for loss and damages caused by the impact of climate change? Alternatively, will it fund preventive actions? If so, how is this different from adaptation funding? And we have another question on the NCQG. What would it mean for the NCQG if we open the contributor base? Will this mean that the responsibility will be based on current responsibility without taking into consideration historical responsibilities? And also, what about the fact that the 100 billion goal went from 800 billion for 8 years to 100 billion? Is there going to be means to ensure that this time, no matter what the number is going to be agreed, it will be reviewed annually? Maybe you can take these two questions.
Exactly. Let's go to Ilari first. Ilari, please go ahead.
Opening the contributor base. That is a very, very political issue, to be honest. We have language in the Paris Agreement. We have principles that have been agreed. We have that. And renegotiating, relitigating that and opening that up, it's something within the time that we have available. It is going to be something quite difficult and definitely something quite political as well. It's probably out of negotiators' hands. It's probably now in the hands of ministers, something like that. But just to be clear, I mean, some of these countries, Gulf states, China, they already provide climate finance. They do. They engage in, they are donor countries in their own right already. It's just that they don't, my perception, my personal opinion is that they don't want to be held accountable for it. They don't want to be told that they have to. They don't want to be told that things have changed and now they have to assume responsibility. And transparency is a consideration as well. Transparency will be much more robust this time around for the NCQG. And obviously, you got to think about whether these countries want to be held accountable by the transparency arrangements for the NCQG. Maybe there could be language in the NCQG decision that strongly encourages, like strongly welcomes and encourages support from those countries that can contribute so that they can continue doing so. In fact, the Paris Agreement says that countries with the capacity can voluntarily contribute, and they already do. But perhaps there could be language in the decision that really strongly calls for this, that really emphasizes the need for this to be a real collective effort. Without having to really renegotiate issues that have been already agreed, because I think that would be quite tricky. Opening the contributor base, I mean, might mean more resources as well, and that is an important consideration. And in terms of contributor base, we can also think about, I mean, we've got to think about that this is really an obligation upon states. Sometimes people interpret contributor base as really incorporating non-state actors as well. And that talks about the role of non-state actors. But in my view, really, the role of non-state actors in this discussion is clear. It's really a state, it's really parties to the Paris Agreement and the conventions, the ones responsible for delivering climate finance. They can use public finance to mobilize private finance, but that's still counted as their responsibility. So in my view, the responsibility of non-state actors, it's very, very limited, and that has to be seen as that, I think, in terms of accountability and tracking that, especially in terms of transparency. I mean, how do you track, how do you account private finance really in this context? I hope that addresses the question. I'm not sure there was a second part of the question, but maybe for time reasons, I'll just hand over to Harjeet. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And I won't take much time. We are already going over time. So very quickly, in terms of what funding should cover, and let me start there. Preventive, no. Ideally, loss and damage fund should not support preventive because that's part of adaptation. And otherwise, there's not going to be a distinction between which fund is funding what. On relief, again, humanitarian system is there, which supports immediate relief. But whenever and wherever there's a gap, loss and damage fund should step in and provide resources. And that's where we are looking at trigger mechanisms and many other ways of supporting. Largely, the way the gap has been identified is focus on rehabilitation and reconstruction. That's where loss and damage fund should focus and provide more resources, because humanitarian community is not able to meet those increasing needs because of the rising scale and frequency of these disasters. So I would say that's what loss and damage fund should be doing, and we should have generally clear distinction between all the funding windows and funds that we have created.
Thank you so much, Larry and Harjeet. Unfortunately, we won't have any more questions. Run over time. So I'm just going to invite Alukita to share her closing remark.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Thank you, Harjeet and Larry, for such an insightful session for demystifying the various aspects of loss and damage and NCQ and how they are interrelated. This is certainly going to help us in the coming meetings related to loss and damage to advocate with better capacity, and also putting our points in COP29. So, so far these two sessions were very insightful for us. I, on behalf of Yango Loss and Damage Working Group and also Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, would like to thank all the presenters and also to the participants who took their time and interest in knowing more about it. And also to the PCCB network who help us in hosting the session. And we aim to have more such sessions in the future, because I think the skilling and capacity building is only the medium, and I think the base through which we will be able to better put our points in the future. So I would like to thank all of you, and would like to see all of you more in the coming sessions. Thank you so much.